Good evening, everyone. Okay, so my name is Elena Ickerman, and this is Melanie Beach, and we would like to welcome all of you to Jesus Who at the University of Guelph.
All right, so Jesus Who is an opportunity for the University of Guelph community to come together and explore some of life's hardest questions. The students and campus ministers who have planned this event are inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer our university in its search for knowledge, truth, and significance.
With that in mind, know that we welcome everyone here who's coming from different backgrounds, perspectives, and commitments. Know that we will honor your questions just as we are coming with our own questions. We really hope that tonight will just not be an academic exchange of ideas, but that it'll really be a chance for the community to come earnestly engaging with these questions.
We hope tonight's event will draw us all into real conversations, questions, discussions, stories, and friendships.
So Jesus Who is being jointly sponsored by a collection of campus groups, including Power to Change, Guelph Campus Ministry, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Asian Christian Fellowship, ECM, University Catholic Connections, and the Chinese Christian Fellowship.
The events throughout the week are also co-sponsored by over a dozen local churches in Guelph.
We're really grateful for everyone who has made this week's events possible. So, as you guys can see, there are comment cards on all of your chairs. If at any point during the talk or any point tonight you have a question to ask our speaker, we invite you to write that question down on the back of the paper, and at the end you can come up and ask that question. So now I would like to introduce to you guys tonight's presenter, University of Guelph graduate Dr. Kirk Durston. Kirk has spoken at most of the universities in Canada on questions relating to the interaction of philosophy, theology, and science. Kirk, please come up.
Okay. I first of all want to thank you for that kind introduction. I also, while I'm amusing myself here, I also want to thank that whole list of clubs that are responsible for these events this week. That's pretty interesting, that list of clubs. I'm very pleased to see so many involved in this event. I want to just whet your appetite tonight on this topic, which is the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Did it actually occur? What sort of evidence, what sort of rational justification can we put together for, at least for the Christian, for believing this? And for those who are not Christians, perhaps there's those who are not religious or maybe agnostic or atheist here as well. Are there any reasons that I can offer to maybe think further on this question? And that's really what I want to do. I want to just take a first pass at looking at the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and the objective would be to stimulate you to think, to get you interested enough to look into this further. And for those who want to look into it further, I'll leave you with an excellent reference that you can order from Amazon or Chapters, and get into much more detail than what I'm going to cover here tonight. I first got interested, or not interested, I first got maybe seriously exposed to the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus when I took a course from William Lane Craig, a theology course from William Lane Craig, and he had done his PhD at the University of Munich on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. His supervisor was Wolfhard Pannenberg. Those of you in theology might recognize that name. And as a result of his PhD research, he has written a number of papers, different books, and teaches courses on this, and this is one of the courses that I took in this area. So what I'm going to share with you are some of the points from the course that William Lane Craig shared with us, or that I took with him on the historical evidence of the resurrection of Christ. Now, there's likely to be mixed opinions here tonight as to whether or not Jesus of Nazareth actually did rise from the dead. But there's one or two things that I think we could all agree on. Number one is that there exists today a world religion called Christianity. Well, I think we could all agree on that. The second thing I think we could agree on is that there seemed to have been some sort of an event in the first century that is responsible for the existence, primarily responsible for the existence of the world religion of Christianity today in its various forms. So what I'm suggesting is that even if we're very skeptical about the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, that it actually occurred, maybe we think it's just didn't happen, we're still left with a problem, and the problem is what was that event? If Jesus of Nazareth did not rise from the dead in the first century, what was that event that caused an explosion of Christianity in the middle part of the first century, such that by the end of it, it had reached as far east as India and had pervaded through much of the Roman Empire? Now, even if that event did occur, and as I said, I'm just going to give you some suggestions as to further study in this area, some of the points. But even if it did occur, what possible interest would it be for us today in the 21st century? Well, Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament documents is recorded as having made some remarkable claims. For example, he claimed that he had always existed, that he had existed prior to even Abraham. He claimed that he was not only God, but a particular God. In that day, there were many gods, Roman gods, Greek gods, and then there was the Jewish God whose name was I Am. He claimed he was I Am. He made that claim very clearly several times, and each time he made that claim, the people clearly understood him to be claiming to be the one who created space-time, matter, and energy, the laws of nature, everything that we see, that he was making that claim, and of course they thought he was blaspheming at the time. He said other things, remarkable claims, that makes it relevant to us in the 21st century. Another remarkable claim he made was that the eternal destiny of every human being that ever has lived and ever will live hinges on him and on what you decide to do about his claims. That's his claim, of course. Whether that's true or not, I realize each one of you has to decide for yourself. So the last thing about him, though, why I think it's relevant, he said there would only be one sign that he would give humanity, just one, and this was prior to his crucifixion. The only sign, when he was asked, why should anyone believe that what he is saying is true, basically that. He says there will only be one sign given to humanity, and that is he will rise from the dead on the third day. Now, they didn't really understand what he meant by rise from the dead, because obviously in their minds he wasn't literally going to come back from the dead, but that's obviously what he meant, and he had to explain that and make it clear that he was actually claiming he would give one sign to the human race, and that was that he would rise from the dead on the third day. So that's why Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But more than that, it's more than just whether Christianity stands or falls. It has implications for every individual in the 21st century if his claim is true, if that actually did happen. Now, what I'm going to present here tonight is not proof that he rose from the dead. That would be, well, I have no idea of anyone alive who could actually provide that proof other than Jesus of Nazareth himself if he were to appear tonight. What I'm going to do is, in any court case, as in any investigation, is just look at some of the evidence, present it to the jury, which is yourself, and then you have to go away and contemplate it. And if you want further evidence, I'll leave you with a source. So just by way of overview, I want to look at my short talk is divided into 3 sections, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions that arise while I'm talking, please remember those. And there's going to be a mic at the end set up somewhere, I think, and you can ask questions. So just by way of overview, I want to begin with looking at the question, did Jesus of Nazareth even exist? Because there are, at least on a popular level, it's not questioned academically, but on a popular level there are many people who are suggesting that Jesus of Nazareth never actually existed. The second section, I want to look at 3 lines of historical evidence that seem to indicate that Jesus of Nazareth actually physically rose from the dead. But remember, when I use the word evidence, it's different from proof, okay? I'm not proving that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm just offering evidence. And evidence is something that bolsters the justification for believing that a particular event happened. It does not prove the event happened. Finally, I want to conclude with two choices that it leaves us with. If he actually did rise from the dead, that's one choice. What are the implications? Or the other choice that you have to make if he did not rise from the dead. So with that in mind, let me begin with this first section, and that is, did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? One way to answer that, or one way to begin to answer that question, is with another question. And the question would be, if Jesus never actually existed, then how do we explain the sheer number of people, the explosion of Christianity in the first century, of people who actually believed that not only did he exist, but he'd physically risen from the dead? How would we explain that? It's a very real historical event. It has changed the course of human history. It would be remarkable for an explosion of people in the first century to be followers of a non-existent person so soon, in the lifetime of the people who were actually following him. It staggers credulity to think that you would have an explosion of a religion following somebody who did not exist. Maybe if that person had existed hundreds of years earlier or 1,000 years earlier, maybe. But it began right there in the first century. But that's just a question to put out there. I want to look at just three historical sources, well, four, but we'll start with three non-Christian sources. First of all, Cornelius Tacitus in the first century Roman historian. Briefly mentions Christians and Jesus Christ. He said that Christians were named after their founder, Christus, whom he referred to as Christus in his writings. He states that Christus was put to death by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, and we know from history that Pontius Pilate had jurisdiction in the area of Jerusalem between it ended in AD 36. So whatever happened would have to happen before AD 36. He also indicates that the execution of Jesus Christ occurred during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Just brief mention by the Roman historian, first century Roman historian, Cornelius Tacitus. There's another source, a non-Christian source, that refers or tells us a little bit about Jesus of Nazareth, and that's the earliest part of the Jewish Talmud. The Jewish Talmud is actually a compilation of Jewish writings, some of which predate the time of Christ, many of which post-date the time of Christ. But the earliest part does talk about this Jesus of Nazareth, not in a very favorable light, mind you, but it does talk about Jesus of Nazareth, and we can infer from that that at least in the minds of those people who wrote those documents at the time, that this Jesus of Nazareth must have existed. It wouldn't make any sense to talk in an unfavorable light if he had never existed, or if they were not favorable to him, just simply point out he never existed. No, the existence of Jesus was accepted in the earliest part of the Jewish Talmud, but it does state a few things. It states that he was crucified. It also states that he was guilty of sorcery. That's interesting because it doesn't contest the idea that Jesus could do things that appear to be supernatural. Rather, it contests where he got the power to do those things from. It claimed that he was guilty of sorcery. It's an early non-Christian source, historical source, that provides some verification, at least, not proof, as I said before, but some perhaps evidence or verification that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' miracles just might be true. There are a lot of letters circulated towards the end of the first century that further talk about those things from Christian sources, but I'm setting those aside for the time being. Also, the earliest part of the Jewish Talmud indicates that Jesus of Nazareth was guilty of spiritually misleading the nation of Israel. Now that's interesting because it not only implies that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed, but that his effect on first century Israel was massive. If they are going to state that he led the nation of Israel into spiritual apostasy or misled Israel spiritually. So, as I said before, the references are not necessarily favorable towards Jesus of Nazareth, but they do seem to provide some evidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed. Finally, I want to look at a particular manuscript by a manuscript of Flavius Josephus. Now, I want to caution you when you're looking at the manuscripts of Josephus, because there are some that appear to have been, let's say, maybe perhaps embellished. Maybe, if you don't want to use that term, maybe more than favorably translated or copied, so to speak. But there is one manuscript of Josephus that the scholars seem to agree on that has never been tampered with or embellished by, let's say, well-meaning Christians or enthusiastic Christians, and that is the Arabic manuscript. And I would refer you to the work of Shlomo Pines and David Flusher of Hebrew University, neither of which, to my knowledge, are Christians. They're Jewish scholars, but their examination of the Arabic manuscript of Josephus leads them to believe it has never been tampered with. So what does the Arabic manuscript state of Josephus? It states, I'm not saying everything that it talks about here about Jesus, but it does state, Josephus writes that Jesus was a wise and virtuous man recognized for his good conduct. So we can at least infer from that that he existed and that he seemed to have a good reputation as far as not getting into criminal trouble too often, except right at the end of his life, and we all know about that. It also states, Josephus, the Arabic manuscript of Josephus states that he had many followers in the first century. Josephus, by the way, was a Jewish Roman historian. He was not a Christian. We can infer that from what he says about Jesus shortly. He also writes that the disciples reported that he had risen from the dead and appeared on the third day after his crucifixion. Now recall that Josephus is a first century historian, and what this tells us is that this belief that Jesus had risen from the dead was not something that arose 200 or 300 years later, as, say, Dan Brown suggests in the Da Vinci Code, in his novel Da Vinci Code. That we have evidence that it was actually a first century belief. Whether it actually occurred or not is a different question, but I'm just arguing here that there's some evidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed, and that the reason, in fact, the next thing he writes, as a result of this belief that he'd risen from the dead, Josephus writes, as a result, his disciples proclaimed Jesus' teachings. In other words, what Josephus is saying here is that in the first century, Christianity was spreading due to an event that his followers thought had happened, and the event was the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. That was the event that is being credited by this non-Christian source. And once again, for those of you who may have missed it, this is the Arabic version or translation of Josephus's writings, which is thought to be untampered with by the scholars, at least David Flusher and Shlomo Pines. And I'm not aware of anyone that any scholar that would contest that. Josephus also indicates that some called him the Messiah. In Hebrew it's Mashiach, means anointed one. In Greek it's called Christos, which where we get our English word Christ from. So in the first century, he was saying his followers believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ, was the Messiah. He says Messiah because he's writing from a Jewish perspective. And then Josephus says something fascinating that tells us two things. He says perhaps he was the Messiah, but his writing indicates that he didn't actually make the decision that he was. He just said maybe he was. So that tells us he was not a follower of Christ, first of all. But the other thing it tells us is that since he was a Jew and he was familiar with the ancient prophecies concerning the Messiah, as far as he could see as a Jew, it appeared that maybe Jesus had actually fulfilled those ancient prophecies, which is another whole lecture in and of itself, which we won't be looking at. So what I've looked at thus far, there's three non-Christian sources that suggest that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed in the first century. The final documents I would point to would be Christian sources. Those would be the 4 New Testament documents, let's say 5 if you count the book of Acts, that actually are more, that are historical narratives. Now I know that there's a tendency to say, oh well, they're from a Christian source, therefore they're biased and we can discount them, but no, that's the poisoned well fallacy, is suggesting that that person has a bias or a reason for saying such and such, therefore such and such is false. All it does is that, yeah, they may have a motive here, and we'll grant that. They may have a motive, but there is an enormous amount of detail in the New Testament that some of which is confirmed by some of these other things I've just quoted from non-Christian sources, others from archaeology and history. So that concludes the first section here, and the first section was just trying to deal with the question, did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? And I've also introduced something, and that was the event that's claimed as early as the 1st century, the event that started Christianity, the event upon which Christianity is based and upon which everything hangs today as far as the claims of Christ. So now let's move into the second section here. I want to look at 3 pieces of historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth physically rose from the dead in the 1st century. And this is not a proof. This is only some evidence that supports that or gives some rational justification for it. Now, we just saw that Josephus in the Arabic manuscript states that the primary reason, the thing that fueled the explosion of Christianity in the 1st century was the belief by 1st century Christians that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. So what we're going to look at now is the question, what made them believe this? What was it that happened in what were the events that made them draw the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth had actually risen from the dead? The first thing that William Craig and others have suggested, there's a knob down here, just let me adjust this, was the empty tomb. Was the tomb actually empty or not? We don't know. I mean, we can't prove that it was empty this late in history, but there are some circumstances in the 1st century that strongly suggest that it was. And many historians, even if they're not Christian, even if they're just simply agnostic historians, will concede that the tomb would have had to have been empty in order for the explosion of Christianity to occur within a few weeks of the alleged resurrection. There's a couple of reasons. I'll just suggest 2 here. Number 1 is that it was the practice in 1st century Israel to venerate the tombs of the prophets. They were maintained and venerated. By venerated, I mean they would go there to pay their respects. They were a very special place that people would go to remember the prophets and to respect them and to claim that we would never do whatever those people did to these people who are now in this tomb. And Jesus points that out. But in the case of the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth, there is absolutely there was no veneration in the 1st century. Today, there is. In fact, there's 2 candidates for the tomb in Jerusalem today. But back then, there was no veneration of the tomb simply because the believers thought he wasn't there. It would suggest that the tomb would have had to have been empty. But there is something that historians believe weighs quite heavily in favor of that tomb being empty. And that is a story provided by Matthew in his writings that the tomb, there was an alternate story as how the tomb got empty, and that is that the disciples had stolen the body while those who were guarding the tomb were sleeping. Now, the reason why historians think this, when historians look at ancient documents, they don't just simply look at, oh, well, this is what it says, therefore it must be true. When they look at those ancient documents, there's always a range of credibility that they will assign to various portions, even within the same document. From virtually no credibility at all to a very high degree of credibility, and then everything in between. When they look at this particular passage, they assign a high degree of credibility for the following reason. If Jesus had not risen from the dead, then, well, basically, if you looked at early Christianity as a false religion, they're just trying to promote a false religion, then of course Jesus would not have risen from the dead. But they're trying to make out that he did. They're trying to claim that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. And the last thing you would want to do is provide an alternate explanation for how that tomb got empty. That's something that you don't want a competing theory if you're trying to push this idea that he'd risen from the dead and that's why the tomb is empty. You don't want a competing theory that you're actually offering as to how maybe the tomb got empty. That is, well, while the guards were sleeping, the disciples stole that body. So that even very conservative historians who take a very conservative view as far as the credibility of the New Testament documents. By conservative, I mean they're very cautious in committing themselves that, to any good degree of credibility on this, would assign a much higher credibility to this than normal. No, if that actually occurred, which they believe it was a story circulated in the first century, then that itself tells us something else. Number one, it tells us that the location of the tomb was known. Secondly, it tells us that it concedes that the tomb was empty. And third, it concedes that the tomb had been guarded by guards. Typically, a guard at that point consisted of a minimum of 4 men. If it was a 24-hour guard, it could consist as many as 16, 4 groups of 4. There's some discussion whether it was actually a Roman guard or the temple guard, one of the two. But it does seem to indicate there was some sort of a guard placed there. So it concedes those things. So as a result, there seems to be good reason to believe that the tomb would have had to have been empty. Now, the objection that the disciples stole the body is not seriously considered today by academics, simply for a number of reasons. I'll just give you maybe 2 or 3 here. First of all, the disciples in stealing that body had absolutely nothing to gain. Now, normally, when you observe certain religions starting up, the leaders of those religions usually have something to gain. It could be wealth, where all the cult followers have to give their assets over to the cult leader. In some cases, like, for example, Jim Jones, the Jim Jones cult, he also obtained, sex. He had prima nocta privileges. That is, when a man got married, he had the first night with the bride, and then the groom got her the rest of the time. So clearly, in the case of Jim Jones, there were some sexual favors, advantages to leading this. There were often financial gains to be made. There's gains of power, where you can set yourself up as, if you want to somehow be some sort of egomaniac. But in the case of the disciples, what they were promoting was exactly the opposite. They were promoting a very high standard of morality. They were actually suggesting that you be prepared to give up all you own and not give it to the disciples, give it to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans. And third, they had no power to gain. There was no power. In fact, they seemed to teach this idea that if you want to be the greatest person in the world, you should become the servant of all of humanity, as Jesus set the role model for. And finally, they actually paid with their lives, most of them. There's possibly one who just died of old age, but most of them paid with their lives. They were actually tortured and executed. So they had absolutely nothing to gain by perpetrating this hoax. Secondly, they were devoted Jewish theists. These were God-fearing men and women spreading this idea that Jesus had risen from the dead. It's utterly foreign to their way of thinking. In fact, it would be blasphemous if they were trying to make this out as a gigantic hoax, claiming that Jesus was God and so on and so forth. Just totally unfitting. And finally, it would be very surprising if not a single follower of Jesus of Nazareth who was involved in this hoax would have confessed when they were being tortured and executed. There were no confessions whatsoever to that effect. Every one of them died firmly believing, and they sacrificed the rest of their lives. So it seems that reasonable to believe, this is one of the reasons, or some of the reasons, why historians today give very little credence to this idea that the disciples stole the body while the guards slept. So first of all, the first line of evidence I would suggest is the empty tomb. The second line of evidence is the explosion of Christianity in AD 33. According to the New Testament documents in the book of Acts, within 5-6 weeks of Christ's alleged resurrection, there were more than 8,000 people right there in the city of Jerusalem itself that were followers of Jesus that believed he'd risen from the dead. It's one thing to spread a rumor far distant from where the actual event was to happen. And it's quite another to persuade thousands of people within a few weeks of this event that it actually happened. Something happened that persuaded the people in Jerusalem that this event had actually happened, that Jesus of Nazareth had actually risen from the dead, such that within 5 or 6 weeks of that resurrection, or alleged resurrection, if you tend to be a skeptic on this, many thousands of people believed that he had risen from the dead. By AD 64, Christianity had spread through very rapidly in the Roman Empire, such that Nero was basically executing Christians by AD 64 in Rome. And by the end of the century, it had spread as far east as India by the Apostle Thomas, and the descendants of those Christians, first century Christians in India, still live there to this day. So this second line of evidence is the explosion of Christianity amid fierce opposition within an already well-established theological position of monotheism. And it was very rapid, and it wasn't just, there's a large quantity of people involved in this explosion. Now, if we take this, the view that nothing caused this explosion, or that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, then we have two things to explain. Number one is, how did that tomb become empty if in fact it is not a credible theory that the disciples stole that body? And number two, what accounts for the explosion of Christianity within weeks, such as many thousands of people in Jerusalem believed that it had occurred? What accounts for that? Now, as I said before, this is not proof that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. It's just a highly unique incident in history that bears, I believe, much further consideration, and I'll tell you how you can look into that a little bit further later. Finally, the third line of evidence I want to offer you for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth are the resurrection appearances, especially during a 40-day period after the resurrection was supposed to have occurred. Professor Dunn of the University of Durham in England states, "It is almost impossible to dispute that at the historical roots of Christianity lie some visionary experiences of the first Christians who understood them as appearances of Jesus raised by God from the dead." Not just apparitions, but appearances of Jesus. And these early appearances, the witness seemed to agree that he appeared physically. They could actually touch him. He could eat food. He was solid. Yet at the same time, he seemed to have the ability to just simply appear and disappear in a room, in spite of the fact that he was perfectly solid. Now, they had the belief at the time that there was going to be a resurrection, but that's not until the end of history. They had no belief at all that it was going to occur, that Jesus would physically rise from the dead. In fact, in the New Testament accounts, we read that the disciples themselves just completely disbelieved that Jesus would rise from the dead. And after he was executed, they went into hiding. And it says, "For they did not believe he would rise from the dead," even when it was told that he had. Now, again, if you are fabricating an account that you want to, and you're the leadership of some religion that you're inventing, you want to make yourself look good. You want to make yourself look like, well, even though everybody else didn't believe, I did, type of person. And so this is another reason why, this is the same reason that I pointed out earlier, that some historians believe that part could be credible as well, that the disciples, prior to the resurrection of Christ, did not believe that he would physically rise from the dead, because they're making themselves look bad. They're discrediting themselves. He occurred to individuals, according to those early first century accounts. He occurred not only just to individuals, but to groups of people. and at least one time to a group as large as 500 people. So the Apostle Paul, when he's writing in Corinthians, refers to this group of 500, and not just some vague nebulous group of 500, but he says, some of whom are dead, but most of whom are still alive. So it tells us that Apostle Paul, who at the time of the crucifixion of Christ was thoroughly an unbeliever. In fact, he was one of the people who opposed the explosion of Christianity at first, until he physically saw Christ. It tells us that he had personal knowledge of these 500 people. He knew them well enough so that he knew that some had passed away, but most were still alive. And it also confirms that around the time period that he was writing was a time when it was not that far long after the resurrection, such that most who had seen Christ after his resurrection were still alive. The other interesting thing about these resurrection appearances in the first century is that he did not just appear to believers, but he appeared to people who did not believe, not only did not believe he'd rise again, but were not even followers of Christ. And some examples are Christ's brothers. He had several brothers. And there's a rather ugly story in one of the New Testament accounts where the word is out that if Jesus appears in Jerusalem, he's going to be killed. And immediately, right after that, it says his brothers say to Christ, well, aren't you going up to this feast? Because if you're somebody special, you should be going up to Jerusalem to make yourself known. And then it says as a subscript, for not even his brothers believed in him. So not only did they not believe in him, he was an embarrassment to the family from their perspective, because he was claiming he was God. Eternal destinies of all humanity were in his hands, but yet they did not believe it until something happened. And that something appears to have been, according to them, they claimed they saw the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth. And 3 of his brothers paid with their lives, according to early first century accounts, including James, his brother. And so these resurrection appearances, once again, are not proof that he rose from the dead. And many historians would deny that they were actually appearances, but they will concede that there are many people in the first century who at least believed that they saw Jesus of Nazareth after his crucifixion and resurrection. That would be the cautious approach that some historians take. But many historians who specialize in this area, perhaps most, concede that they at least believed they saw Jesus of Nazareth, even if the historian himself or herself does not actually believe they actually saw Jesus. Now, this raises another question. What if Jesus did not rise from the dead? What would have caused so many people over a 40-day period to believe that they saw Jesus of Nazareth, and not just an apparition, but in apparently a physical form that they could touch, that he could speak to groups as large as 500 people? But there's something else interesting about these appearances of Jesus after his crucifixion and resurrection, and that is they don't completely end 40 days afterwards. Later on, Paul saw Jesus, but what's more fascinating is that they appear to still, there's some evidence that they're continuing to this day. I want to give you 2 examples. Number 1 is there are many, many claims coming out of the Middle East by people who were devout Muslims, who claim that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, has personally appeared to them. It has completely changed their life, and as a result, they have put their faith in Christ. Those people have nothing to gain by saying that. Many of them pay with their lives because that's not a popular thing in some of the areas where they live. Some of them are in jail right now, but they insist, as devout Muslims as they were, that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, has personally appeared, and that is the defining moment in their lives that has convinced them that he is who he claimed he was. So we have many people, and they're continuing on to this day, and they're especially coming out of the Middle East, where Christianity is not the primary religion. They are especially coming out of the Middle East from people who are not disposed to believe in these sorts of things. Does that prove that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Of course not. But what I'm trying to get you to do is to consider, if he did not, then what is going on here? What went on in the first century? What actually was the event that occurred? And what is happening today? The second example of an appearance of Jesus of Nazareth that I'm going to give a modern day appearance of just happened about a month ago in Waterloo. And I have talked to the mother. It involved a 3-year-old girl. Now you might say that's absolutely not credible, but let me give you the circumstances. I know the mother personally. She is a very quiet, conservative woman, would never make up stories, and she is a reputable person. Up until the time she began having children, she worked with autistic children. And this event occurred about a month ago, and I questioned her personally. And I asked her more questions. I followed up questions. I wanted to find out as much detail about this event as possible. She was the 3-year-old girl, who I also know was playing upstairs in the living room. The mother was downstairs working. And all of a sudden, the 3-year-old girl came down the stairs, and the mother could tell that something highly unusual. The girl was wide-eyed. She was in a state of disbelief, perhaps we would say, of awe. She was shocked, but the mother says she was not fearful, but she was just, the mother knew that something had happened before the girl even said a word, and she says, "What happened?" And then the girl, who is, although she's about three and a half years old, is a very good communicator. I know her well, and she is a very good communicator. She just says, "I saw God." And so the mother continued to question her, what did you see? What did he look like? What did he say? And the mother was completely, by the girl's demeanor, she knew the girl was not making this up. She came down the stairs in the state that she was, that she had seen something in the living room. And the further questioning, the mother concluded, and I have to conclude as well, that it was again another one of these appearances. They often occur to younger children. They don't occur as much to adults, except in the case where I said in the Middle East, where many Muslims are claiming that they have seen Jesus of Nazareth personally. So, not proof. I just want to stir your minds a little bit. I want to get you thinking. But I want to suggest that something is going on here in human history. And it started long before the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, because there were ancient prophecies concerning the Messiah, that the Messiah would rise from the dead, that he would not rot in the grave, that he would one day return at the end of history. After his execution, it said that he would lay his life down for all of humanity. I'm getting into the final section here. But just to summarize, as I stated at the outset, this is not proof. None of it is. You might say, if you were sitting in court right now and you were the jury, you might say, well, I don't know. I don't know. Some of you might think it's a pretty, maybe not, if not a compelling case, at least a thought-provoking case. That's all I can hope for, is to provoke your thoughts. It's a thought-provoking case. There is one more thing that I think I could do, and it's what I've done in my own investigation. When you investigate an urban myth, what you will find is that the more you investigate it, the more you find out, the faster it comes unraveled, and you find out that just simply are not the details there to support it. When I began to investigate the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, I found quite the opposite. So I want to suggest a book for you. It's probably the state of the art. It's an academic book. So you're going to get something far more detailed, far more in-depth than anything you've heard tonight. I want to recommend the following book. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and the author is Michael Licona. That's The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and that's by Michael Licona. Now, in conclusion, I said there was one last section. It leaves us basically with two choices. And I don't expect us to make these choices this evening. I just want to get you started on thinking about the two choices. Number one, it never happened. That's choice number one that you can make, is that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth never happened. But I want to say two things, if that's the choice you find yourself wanting to make. Number one, the first thing is, could it be that you are making an a priori denial of the supernatural? Do you believe it didn't happen because you a priori rule out the supernatural? Now, there's a whole lot could be said about that. I suggest that most, if not all of us, are, at least in the younger days of our life, it appears self-evident to us that there's more to us than just simply a bag of meat sitting in the chair, that there's something more to us. There's something not natural. Here's a way you might contemplate it. You are all going to die. We're going to die. That's simply a fact. How does it feel, if you deny the supernatural, how does it feel to know that that's it? It's game over. Now, intellectually, you might say, well, that's just the way it is, but intuitively, do your intuitions match that? Now, I realize that a person can reprogram their intuitions to match their intellect, what they choose to believe, but I'm just stirring the pot a little bit. What do your intuitions tell you about what happens when you die? Is it really the end? And I say this in the context of wanting you to consider the possibility that you have made an a priori denial of the supernatural. I would like to offer it as a live option. You don't have to believe that the supernatural exists, but just at least don't rule it out in advance. Secondly, if it never happened, if that's your choice, what is your explanations of the events? The empty tomb, the explosion of Christianity within weeks of his resurrection, many thousands of people believing he'd risen from the dead. You need, if you want to approach this historically, you need to come up with a detailed alternate historical explanation. And then there's the resurrection of appearances, which seem to be continuing to this day, and primarily, almost entirely, amongst those people who would never have believed they would have such an experience. The other choice is that maybe it did happen. Maybe it did happen. So what are the implications for us in the 21st century? And the implications are this. The ancient prophecies indicated that that God himself would one day step into space-time as a human being. It suggests that God is flawlessly just, but also is the origin of perfect love and honor. And so he has a problem. Because all of us have done things that are wrong, flawless justice must be carried out, but yet God is also the origin of perfect love. What if God himself stepped into humanity as a human being in order to satisfy the demands of flawless justice, the infinite demands, so that he could then satisfy the demands of perfect love? And what if he was the Messiah that had been prophesied for thousands of years before Christ arrived, and as Jesus claimed that he was? What if this is true? So there's more at stake, there's more substantiating Christ than just the resurrection. There's the prophecies, but as I said, that's another question. If that's the case, then something that Jesus said makes a lot of sense. He said, "He who believes in me shall live even if he dies." In other words, the thing that separates us from the being who is the origin of beauty and love and music and art and justice and honor and power and every good thing given and every perfect gift, the thing that separates us from such a being is that we are not perfect. We've fallen vastly short of, say, flawless beauty, for example, perfect justice. That's what separates us from God. But if what Christ said was true, if he actually did rise from the dead, verifying his claims, then that penalty for the things that we've done has been satisfied. That the demands of flawless justice for you yourself personally has been satisfied. And if you want that relationship, if you want to have a personal relationship with the one who is the creator of space-time, the origin of love and beauty and music and every good thing, if you want that relationship, then it's offered to you as a gift according to what Jesus said. All you have to do is to, I guess, stake your chips on him. Put your faith in Jesus of Nazareth, that he is who he claimed he was, that he actually paid the penalty of perfect justice so that he could then satisfy demands of perfect love. So personally, as it comes for myself, what I did after considering this for some time, I didn't accept this myself the first time I heard it, so I perfectly understand if you're not ready to take that step either. But after I'd thought about it for some time, it occurred to me that if God loved me enough to do that, then I could trust him. So what I did was I simply made up a prayer, and I made it to Jesus of Nazareth, and I asked him to come into my life, take away the sin that separates me from God, and give me eternal life. That is the defining step, I think, of what determines your eternal destiny, what makes you a, let's say, a true Christian as opposed to, let's say, merely a religious Christian, and what will change the course of your life from this time forward. So I think I'll leave you with that. The decision is yours. Think carefully about it, and remember that book that I referred you to. And with that in mind, I think, do I take questions now, or is there something else that happens first? Questions? Okay, so I'm going to take questions. Yeah, microphone right there. And so anybody, for the sake of, so that everybody can hear the question, I think the organizer would prefer you'd state it into the microphone there so that everybody can hear. And I will attempt to answer that question. I'm not the fount of all knowledge, but if I can't answer it, I'll refer you to various sources. One other source, if you want a Jewish perspective, an Orthodox Jewish, there's Pinchas Lapid, an Orthodox Jew, not a Christian, who has also concluded that the historical evidence does seem to indicate that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. There's William Lane Craig, and then there's the book I referred you to. Any other questions about anything at all to do with anything that I talked about here? I know there's questions, but I know it's also difficult to just talk into the microphone there. There's a question.
Just want to get things started. So I wrote mine down here. So I found that many people on this topic are either kind of all in or all out, and it's very different than history classes that I've sat through, where you just kind of be like, oh yeah, I believe that Canada was founded then, or whatever. I'm just wondering if why you believe that's the case, that there's so much to, like, why what you just explained is not seemingly the common, like, common belief. Do you know, if you know what I'm saying?
Well, that's the big question. Why does not the majority hold this belief that Christ rose from the dead and so forth? I have talked personally one-on-one with well over 1,000 university students, and we've discussed these things. And there might not be one particular reason, but there is one reason that's far more common than anything else. Although I think a second reason is emerging in say, the last, say, 10 years. There probably, I'll give you two reasons why that might be the case. Number one, historically, is that there are, that in my years of talking with students, is that there are massive philosophical implications for how you live your life, for that you are accountable to a higher being, that there is a moral law out there that you will be held accountable to someday. There is also the implication that we are not the greatest thing that ever happened in the universe, that there is another being that's actually greater than humanity, and that's kind of hard on the ego sometimes. We like to think that we've climbed to the top of the evolutionary heap, and this is, you know, even though I'm not personally responsible for doing it, you like to feel that it is some sort of an accomplishment, and there is no, that's one reason. That's one reason that's often been given to me, is that the philosophical implications and the implications to how my life might change if I made this step, are too scary. And I'd have to say I identify with that to a certain extent, because that was the reason, one of the reasons I put it off for the time being, and I just had to think about it, is that I guess basically I was scared to make the decision. By that point, I believe there was a God, but he was so huge. It was so, I had no idea what he's going to do if I make that step. I couldn't do that. So that's one reason. Another reason might be, and I think this is really emerging as a very common reason, is that our society has worked very, very hard to convince itself that science explains everything, including the origin of science itself. That even for the origin of nature upon which science is based, science has an explanation for what it's based upon. If you think about that, there's a circular problem with that, but that's another discussion. But our society is working hard to convince itself that science explains everything, and there's just a flat-out denial of the supernatural. In spite of the fact that it might seem self-evident to us that we might have a soul, at least earlier on in our life, we eventually convince ourselves we don't. And so when someone comes along and says like what I have said tonight, it just seems so absurd. It just seems so unbelievable. It just seems so counter with how we feel we've advanced in the 21st century. And so it just strains, flat out strains credulity. And I understand that. But all I can say is that the more I have looked at it, the more detailed, the more rigorously I've looked at it. And I've only been giving you a very superficial look tonight at it. I'm suggesting there's a much more academic, in-depth approach you could take. The more I've looked at it, the more it seems to stand up. And secondly, when I made that step, there was a radical change in my own life that I had never tried to change. I've changed in ways I never tried to. I've actually experienced the presence of God many times. Usually several times per day as I'm doing different things. I'm aware of the presence of God with me. And I would have to say that it's the most fulfilling thing I've ever experienced, by far. And I haven't lived a deprived life by any stretch. But it's just a whole quantum leap to a new level of fulfillment, is knowing the one who is the origin of beauty itself. Just think about that for a couple of weeks. What would it be like if beauty was personified and you could actually know that person? And that's just beauty. What about justice personified, and so on and so forth? So those are in summary, it strains credulity. It just seems totally absurd to believe in this stuff. And secondly, even if you're disposed to maybe believe in it, there are massive philosophical implications you may not be prepared to make. So that would be, but I see there's another question here. So.
Yeah, as you know, I've got lots of questions, but
a lot of questions.
But I'm going to try and go as big as possible here. I'm big on the concept of responsibility and being responsible for your actions. So I'm going off of your, if this had actually happened, what would be the consequences? And I just have to ask kind of a two-parter here. Oh, is it? Okay. Does this mean, if Christ rose from the dead, that he takes responsibility for our sins, especially original sin and sins of the Father and that sort of thing? And if he does take responsibility for our sins, what does this do for our sort of moral system if we allow for a transfer of responsibility for our actions or things that we should be responsible for?
Okay, well, if I've misunderstood your question, then by all means jump in and correct me.
It's kind of a big question.
Yeah. So if I understand what you're asking here, if the moral culpability for our wrongdoings has been transferred to Jesus, then what are the moral implications for us?
Because it seems to me that just allowing for the concept of transferring responsibility for your actions kind of tears apart a lot of what we believe in for our justice system, for example. And if that's too big of a question, I can ask.
No, it's a very good question. I just want to make sure I answer it properly, or at least begin to answer it properly. We have the concept, at least, within our sense of justice, that justice has to be satisfied, first of all. For example, I've worked in other countries where if the judge likes you and is your friend, you can do pretty much whatever you want, but because the judge likes you, he lets you off the hook. And I've often run into this idea here in Canada that if God loves us, why doesn't he just forgive us for all the wrongdoings we've done? In other words, there's no demands of justice that need to be satisfied. Just say, I forgive you. But intuitively in our justice system, we would see that as corruption if the judge likes you and you're off the hook. So somehow we have this notion that justice has to be satisfied, but is it counterintuitive to our sense of justice that if the penalty is too great for us to pay, or the consequences are too massive, that it's wrong for someone who loves us very dearly, at least, to offer to take our place? There are occasions in history where people have offered to take another person's place when they were being executed for whatever. Why? Because they loved that person. And I realize justice says there is no moral obligation on the part of that other person to step in. We also think, though, we might have a problem if another person takes the consequences, moral culpability for my actions, and then I see it as a kind of like a blank check, or I see it as trivial and I don't value that. So I think even if we will concede that it's okay for someone who greatly loves another person and dearly does not want to see that person pay the consequences to at least offer to step in, the question is it wrong if they actually are permitted to? I would say it kind of depends on the reaction of the person who was the wrongdoer, I think. It would be wrong for a person to pay the consequences, let's say for a murder over there, if that murderer was completely unrepentant and planned to just continue on doing what they did, then it would seem to me that the person who paid the penalty for that person over there and actually let that person out of jail and off the hook, there's something wrong with that. I'll concede that. There's something wrong with that. The only thing that I think makes a difference intuitively, and I'm just suggesting this, I'm not saying that everybody thinks the same way, is that that person so valued what the person who loved them did that their life was then devoted to at least trying to be like the person who gave their life for him. Like the murderer decided, that is such a gift that I'm going to devote the remainder of my life to trying to be the kind of person that so-and-so was who stepped in to fill my place. I'm not saying I've given you a knockdown, shut them up type argument, but I'm appealing to our delicate
It sort of
intuitions.
seems right that if you're going to exceed responsibility, at least, you know, try and change your intent and try and focus on something else rather than your crime for the rest of your life. And then you can sort of try and exceed responsibility if you do that.
Yeah. No, in this case, though, in the case of Christ, though, it's a little bit different.
It's bigger than that, yeah.
Because, well, in the case I gave, offered one human stepping into another human, that human who gave his life to save that murderer's life over there doesn't really know what that person is thinking inside.
And God does.
Whereas in Christ's case, he says what he really looks at is the heart. So what's really going on in the heart. So he knows that this whole, I would call it, that aspect of being spiritually reborn, that step of faith, involves God knows your heart. Your heart says, I have messed up big time. I'm in deep trouble. I want this gift. God knows it's sincere, and that's the only way he says it works. It only works if the other person is sincere. If they're not sincere, you can pray, you know, that example prayer, for example, I said that I prayed. You could write that, you pray it 100 times a day for the rest of your life. You might as well recite a recipe for chocolate cake. It's just not going to work. So in order to work, it has to be sincere, and I think the sincerity then is the thing that then makes it both that God can justify us as well as still be just. Yeah. Well, anybody else have a question? And if you don't, then by all means, the fellow said he had lots of questions. Feel free to ask more. But any other questions? By the way, this is just informal, so if you want to take off, by all means do. Obviously there's no obligation to hang around, but if you are interested, please ask some more questions and I'll see what I can do.
Okay, I got a question. From what I understand, the Muslim teaching about these events is that they do believe that there was a historical Jesus, but when it came to the crucifixion, that the Jesus that you're talking about was actually taken out of the way and there was a substitute. So is there any way to accommodate that explanation with the historical facts, in your view?
Well, in the Muslim account, it was God orchestrating behind the scenes to arrange that little shuffle or exchange, that substitute. First of all, there is absolutely, I would say, with all due respect, there does not appear to be any historical evidence that would actually support that notion, that in the minds of Jesus' followers, he had been crucified. They actually physically took him down from the cross, handled the body after it was dead. So it would be hard for them to somebody be like, in one perspective is it's Judas Iscariot who winds up on the cross as a sort of poetic justice. But well, let's look at it from two perspectives. One perspective is God was involved and he did the switcheroo. The other perspective is that God was not involved and there was some sort of a switching that took place and the real Jesus was not crucified. That option I don't think historically can stand. There's just far too much. All the evidence supports this idea that he was crucified. There is nothing at all that suggests that he wasn't. And even if he had not been crucified, the problem is that Jesus would, and it was sort of how he was switched. He escaped the crucifixion and then appeared afterwards in his mortal form, claiming he'd risen from the dead. The problem with that is that he would have grown old and he would have died, and he has to somehow disappear and still make out like he rose from the dead. That's a problem there. I think that the onus would be on those who would argue that that happened to provide some sort of historical case for that. I would say there's no historical case. It's not seriously entertained. Now, the other situation is God did the switch. Until I would like to see some sort of an argument as to why that would be, because again, the onus is on the person who suggests that that's a switch. And if God is involved, there's another far larger problem, and that is the Muslim also believes that Jesus is a prophet. And we have a case here that if Jesus is a prophet of God, then what he says must be true. And he led the people to believe before his crucifixion that he was going to be crucified. After he rose from the dead, he clearly not only led them to believe, but even argued, for example, on the road to Emmaus with those two people, he argued that this had to be the case, that the Messiah would have to die for the sins of humanity. And so it leaves a person who both believes that Jesus is a prophet of God, but doesn't believe that he rose from the dead, in a dilemma, because it leaves Jesus making false claims, in which case he's a false prophet and he can't be a prophet of God. So if he is a true prophet of God, he would have had to been telling the truth. The only other option is that, as some would suggest, well, the New Testament accounts were corrupted and that's not really the way it was. But a problem with that, if you're coming from a Muslim point of view, is that there is a passage in the Quran where Muhammad writes, if you don't believe what I'm saying, I'm paraphrasing here, then ask the people of the book. The people of the book referring to Jews and Christians. So if Muhammad in 600 AD was asking those people to confirm what he said by asking Jews and Christians, then it implies that the beliefs of Jews and Christians were, at least still at 600 AD, uncorrupted by their holy writings, which implies that the holy writings were not corrupted yet. But if that's the case, our modern translations that we have today are translated from manuscripts that predate 600 AD. So this argument that the New Testament documents were corrupted and the story's all been changed around doesn't stand. It doesn't stand historically, and I don't think it stands theologically, because if Jesus did not die and rise from the dead, then all the prophecies, especially Isaiah 53, that stated the whole reason why this Messiah would die for humanity was to make them clean in the sight of God, to purify all nations, to pay the penalty for sin. That wouldn't have been done. And so a person who holds that theory still finds himself in a predicament on Judgment Day when they stand before God, and God says, why should I give you eternal life in light of the fact that you've not accepted the payment for your sins? I don't know what such a person would say. They could say, well, I did this and that, I was a very good person, and God might say, well, yeah, according to this list, you are a remarkably good person, but there's still a matter of a few sins here, and what have you done to arrange for payment for that? It's not a sin against a person, it's a sin against the one who's the origin of beauty and justice itself. The penalty is massive. How have you paid for that? So, I don't know, just kind of a quick answer from different approaches. Any other questions with regard to anything at all that might have come to mind as a result of this little presentation? Another question back there, yes? I'm afraid I can't hear you. She'll get as close as she can to you with the mic, and then...
So my question is, how were the four Gospels chosen? The Gospel of Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. There were other Gospels that were written. And so what information do we have about the choice of the Gospels? And there were also the Gnostic Gospels, which one argument against the Gnostic Gospels is that they were written after the death of their alleged authors. Like, for example, the Gospel of Judas, for example, was written after the death of Judas, for example. So how were the four Gospels chosen, and what are other arguments against the Gnostic Gospels?
Yeah, okay. Good question. There's a good book by F.F. Bruce that deals with the New Testament documents and how we got those. There's a number of books out there. But the gist of it all is that the New Testament documents appeared to be spontaneously accepted in the first century as the gospel, as scripture, for example. So by the time of the end of the first century, we have Christians writing letters to each other, quoting what they believe to be the scriptures, the New Testament documents, such that you could probably reconstruct the majority of the New Testament just from their quotes. It wasn't until towards the end of the 4th century where we see our official list of what, and even that last point on that list is argued whether or not it was an add-on later on. But long before then, there was just a spontaneous general acceptance of the New Testament as we have it today, Matthew through the book of Revelation, with no meetings held to decide what's in and what's out. I know that many people believe that was done at the Council of Nicaea, but that's not actually what they discussed at the Council of Nicaea. There was another council after that where they wanted to make sure that, where they discussed issues more closely to that. And there was a number of items that were posted as a result of that council near the end of the 4th century. And one of the last item, which was, most scholars agree as an add-on at some point later, was a list of what is officially endorsed as the New Testament documents. But we have some of our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. Three of the three earliest ones, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrius, and Codex Sinaiticus, predate that conference, that council. So it seems from all the evidence we can gather that there was no council, there was no decisions being made by any particular group of people. By the end of the 1st century, the New Testament as we have it today there had been a consensus pretty much arrived, or at least into the early part of the 2nd century. Now, as you pointed out, the Gnostic Gospels, some of the earliest ones were towards the end of the 2nd century. They began appearing at the end of the 2nd century, and they're so far removed from the historical facts or the historical events that they're not taken seriously as an historical account of the life of Jesus. They're more studied as informing us about Gnostic thinking. And even if they were taken more seriously, there is very little said in the Gnostic Gospels that conflict with the historical accounts of the death and resurrection, or basically the historical accounts in the 4 New Testament Gospels. So that's just a quick answer. There was no decision made at the time. It just spontaneously rose, which is what one would expect if God is presiding over history. He is the one that's orchestrating the assembly of the books that later become the Bible, the Scriptures. If God himself is behind that, then I think it speaks for the credibility of the New Testament that it was just spontaneously accepted all over Christendom. There were some dissenting opinions here and there, but the general consensus was these are the books of the New Testament, not just the 4 Gospels, but the entire New Testament. If in fact a council had decided these things, or worst case scenario, one man had, then we would have, I think, more grounds to be suspicious about the compilation of the New Testament. And indeed, some of the criticisms brought to bear by those who are those non-academics, those people like, say, Dan Brown, is to suggest that this was a backroom deal. But the evidence, the history clearly doesn't support that. It was a spontaneous thing that just happened over the first 100 years. Any other questions? Just to follow up, a couple of references. F.F. Bruce, I think it's called the New Testament Documents. That's a very scholarly source. Another one that's, I'd say, pretty scholarly, it's sort of halfway between the layperson and the scholarly level, is Norman Geisler. Introduction to the Bible. It spends an enormous amount of time looking at the ancient manuscripts, the Gnostic things, when they're written, and so on and so forth. So there's further reading you could do in those areas. And you can just Google, those names will come up. Those are 2 scholars that are reputable in the field, let's put it that way. On the internet nowadays, it's hard to tell who the reputable scholars are and who are not, but Norman Geisler, F.F. Bruce, some good references there. Any other questions about anything at all? I feel bad you're all sitting there. Yeah, please feel free to take off. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to ask questions. If there's no more further questions, what will do is I'll hang around for a bit up here. And so if something occurs to you over the next few minutes, I'll be up here or walking around somewhere, just ask me. So I think I'll turn it back to the MCs.